We would now like to introduce Paulette Tate, Vice Chair of the Colorado Humanities Board of Directors.
Good evening and welcome to Latinx Equity Before and After COVID, the fourth in an ongoing series of programs to encourage understanding and discussion about the legacy of race and ethnicity in America and how together we can make a change now for a better future later. Thank you to our sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Durango Herald, Ground Floor Media and Center Table, Tate Law, Arapahoe Libraries, and the many community partners who are posting or streaming this program. A special thank you to Mike Ferrufino, President and CEO of the Colorado Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and Jesus Carrillo for providing media production services. I'd also like to recognize the Board of Directors and staff members on our Changing the Legacy of Race and Ethnicity Committee, and a special thank you to Colorado Humanities staff, Josephine Jones, Nora Ridgway, Christine Goff, and Executive Director Maggie Koval for their commitment in delivering this important programming. Tonight, we have a very special program. Bobby LeFebre is an award-winning writer, performer, and cultural worker. He is Colorado's 8th Poet Laureate, and he is the youngest and first ever person of color to be appointed to this position. In 2004, he co-founded Café Cultura, a nonprofit organization that uses poetry for youth literacy and educational and cultural development. He currently serves as a board member for the Clifford Still Museum, an advisory council member for the Latino Cultural Arts Center, an advisor for the mayor's Denver Institute of Equity and Reconciliation, Best Denver, a two-time Grand Slam champion and a National Poetry Slam finalist. He is also a two-time TEDx speaker. We are delighted to have him perform for us today. Thank you, Bobby.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Super glad to be here. This poem is called Here Where We Are the Flowers. I wrote a lot during the pandemic about what we were going through collectively, and this poem actually marks the end of my writing journey through the pandemic. One day, the globe is spinning. We are smiling or not. Mundane or magic normalcy walks on 2 feet. Autopilot guides our way. Things are the way we know them to be. New lovers braid their fingers together for the first time as the sun sets. The Zócalo is full. The mercado is loud and abundant. The city is a body living and breathing. We go about our day. The cumpleañera blows out her birthday candles. We hug our grandmothers with reckless abandon. Every seat at the dinner table is full of friends and family. We are laughing. Mouths flung open, words unapologetically traveling upon the wind, vivacity abounds. The next day, the globe stops. Together we furrow our brow, stumble off kilter, our hearts become ticking time bombs, panic begets panic, all of us running in place, the unknown tethers itself to our collective consciousness, our psyche, a lone wolf howling at the moon. We retreat. Replace wings with worry, trade the social for the solitary, make an enemy of touch. Distance becomes our God. 6 feet apart, running away from 6 feet under. We forget how to look each other in the eye. Survival becomes a dreary song we play on repeat. Our hands are chapped from reading one too many headlines. Then slowly together, we attempt to construct a new language, knowing words like our leaders are failing us. We begin to speak in statistics, but here the numbers are lives, the percentages are people. Meanwhile, the curve is rising. The crescendo, a destination uncharted, the corporeal, try and coax their jettisoned souls back into their bodies. And there are so many bodies. Blood, bones, flesh, wrinkles, birthmarks, tattoos, dimples, eyes, scars. Existence is upended, a hemisphere uprooted, the earth confused by all the graves here where land is acknowledged but never returned. Grief morphing into trauma, collective mourning, curses shouted to the heavens, candles lit where life should be. How did we become bygone? We've all lost something, found ourselves digging in unknown places, in places we've never been, territory uncharted, jutting emotions, a compass pointing in directions we have never traversed, anguish operationalized, but they who have a why to live can bear almost anyhow. So let us return to the circle, this holy hoop of hope that is unending. Let us lick each other's wounds, offer one another the medicine of mutual aid. Let our mourning morph into ritual. Let our grief be a tender mercy. Let these tears be libation. Let us become the altar, something living, something unfixed, something capable of transforming. Let us be both the memory and the imagination, the stewards of bridging yesterday to tomorrow. Let us remember so that we never forget. And here at this monument, at this memorial embodied, we will learn to harness and activate our anger, channel and transform our anxiety. Here, we will exist unafraid to sit in our sadness, to allow for it to fester until it transmutes into healing. Let our bruises become a balm. Let our gaping wounds become mouths that translate the pain. It is okay to not be okay. Let us bathe in our brokenness, evolve in our emptiness, faith keeping us forward facing. And in this place we see but have yet to arrive upon, let us create new meaning, social reconstruction in our hands here at this human memorial, at this monument in the flesh where we are the flowers, where we are the prayers. Let us say and remember all their names. Let us shout our own into the void so loudly that the unborn waiting somewhere in the cosmos will smile celestially and proud, and we will walk together across time and space with understanding and empathy, arms linked together, healing and heard, and life will bend into tomorrow with promise. I promise. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. That was beautiful. Today's moderator is a community organizer with decades of experience in facilitation, deepening community engagement, and campaign management. She understands that community organizing is something we build and create. It does not just magically happen. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Theresa Trujillo from the Center for Health Progress. Theresa?
Thank you, Paulette. And thank you, Bobby. That was so powerful. What an incredible way to get started this evening. I want to be clear that tonight I'm opting to use the word Latinx. And I realize that that word lands differently on different folks in our community. My rationale for replacing the gendered Latino or Latina, the O or the A, is due to my own evolving understanding that we exist beyond gender binary of strictly male or female. And so in deference to the fact that today is Trans Visibility Day, I would also invite others to try on the word Latinx. Colorado has a rich history when it comes to civil rights. Major civil rights efforts for women, African Americans, Native Americans, Latinx folks, people with disabilities, they've all occurred here in our state. After the civil rights movements nationally of the 1960s, Colorado was one of the more equitable places in the nation for folks who we sometimes refer to as minorities. That began to change, however, in the 80s and the 90s. In January of 2013, the Rocky Mountain iNews investigative reporting team released a report called Losing Ground. Many of you may remember that. iNews journalists sought to ascertain the relative well-being of Colorado's three major population groups: whites, Latinx folks, and Blacks. What they found is Latinx and Black residents have lost ground compared to white residents. The research is based largely on 6 decades of U.S. Census Bureau data from 1960 through 2010. The three groups were more equitable in the first decades analyzed and less so in those more recent decades of the 2000s all the way through 2010. And I would say those inequities have even deepened since that report was released. The census categories examined were family income, poverty, high school and college graduation, and home ownership. Health data and justice records examined also showed deep disparities. I was working at the state capitol when that report was released, and I remember facilitating numerous community conversations around the report. The findings are both counterintuitive and disturbing. Counterintuitive because one might easily assume that the many government policies, programs, and laws originating in the civil rights movement era and aimed at leveling the playing field would have led to narrowing those gaps. Nearly a decade ago, folks found the findings disturbing because of what they implied about our state's future. The conversation around where Latinx Coloradoans are today, where we hope to be in the future, and how we can get there is the focus of our time together this evening. And so joining us on this platform, in addition to Bobby LeFebre, are Deborah Ortega, Councilwoman at Large for the Denver City Council. Deborah is passionate about creating sustainable community with economic and housing opportunity for all. Also joining us, Angela Cobián, a community organizer currently serving on the Denver Public School Board of Education. She continues advocacy for civic and social change as the director of coalition advocacy at Planned Parenthood Federation of America and Action Fund. And Mike Ferrufino, who is the president and CEO of the Colorado Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. As a business owner and entrepreneur, Mike has significant experience developing business strategies and leading strategic partnerships. And we also hope that you, our viewers and listeners joining us live for tonight's conversation, will participate. There are lots of options for submitting your questions and your comments. So welcome everyone on our panel. Thank you all for being here this evening. And to get us started, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to share a bit about their concerns for Latinx folks in Colorado. What are the significant gaps you see? How has the pandemic impacted the Latinx community? And Mike, if you'd like to start, we'll move forward from there to Deborah, then Angela, and then Bobby.
Thank you very much for being able to go through and put this together. I want to thank Paulette and all the members of the Colorado Humanities staff. And I'm hoping I'm seeing a little lag on myself. So perhaps you need to, if you're seeing lag on my side, Jesus, maybe switch me out and go to somebody else. But if not, I would say that that part of what I'm seeing as a challenge is the overall challenge in terms of not understanding the size of the Hispanic community. So I think that's the first thing that we're seeing at one point is that there is a difficulty in terms of understanding that right now we have a population that is Hispanic that we consider monolithic, and not understanding the different channels and the different types of specific areas that each one of these basically represent. And so I'm getting a little bit, so Jesus, can you pull me off? I'm getting feedback on my side, so.
Teresa, you're muted.
So Deborah, we'll go to you and we'll ask you to respond to the question, how you believe Latinx folks are faring in Colorado, and particularly now as we move through the pandemic and hopefully are coming out of the pandemic. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are your hopes and concerns?
So I first want to make sure that we paint part of this picture with some light, because it's not all doom and gloom, right? And the fact is we have large Latino and Latina representation, both in our state legislature and in local government offices, so that when we talk about shaping policy as it impacts our community, we're sitting at the table and we're helping make sure that issues that are impacting our community or that have during the COVID timeframe are front and center. So for example, and I don't know if Angela was going to talk about any of this, but during the pandemic, we had the local elected officials from Northwest and West Denver who came together and met every single day with the focus on making sure that we were pushing out information to our communities so that they knew where they could go get tested. They knew where the food sites were for the families that were struggling to to feed their children because so many of them had lost their jobs. It was all those kinds of resources. And even now, making sure that we are sharing information about where people can go to get the vaccine, because I'm finding that there are still seniors who were in that very first tier that were supposed to be vaccinated who still haven't been able to find out where to go get their vaccines. So we have played a vital role as elected leaders in trying to make sure that the information is available. And I'm very grateful to our city of Denver and specifically our library system, who played a vital role in being open with information and also providing hotspots to so many of our families with children who were working, having classes from home, and maybe they got a computer sent home, but if they didn't have connectivity, that was a problem. So our library provided hotspots for them so that many of our kids and families who are looking for jobs could utilize the internet to be able to access jobs. So those are just a couple of examples of, part of the role that local elected Latino and Latina leaders played in trying to ensure that people in our community had what they needed so that they weren't struggling even more so.
And I would point out that in many spaces, there were a number of folks who acted out of mutual aid in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities, in their own social groups, in order to fill some of the gaps, because there were a number of gaps that weren't being paid attention to by leaders. And this was my experience, certainly outside of the metro area and here in the southern part of the state. But the ways in which people have come together, and particularly organizations that typically work on systems change, waded right into direct service to ensure that folks who were not receiving the services that they needed and getting their immediate needs met were getting their immediate needs met. And so that was a really significant piece that I think a number of folks in the community have also stepped up to create those systems of support for one another. We know that we as Latinx folks really depend on and lean into social capital. That's one of our greatest strengths for our community. And so when we have things like social distancing, that removes a lot of our capital, that removes a lot of that strength from us. But folks have found lots of creative workarounds to that. So thank you, Deborah, for that snapshot of where you're seeing things. Angela, I'd love to hear from you about what your perspectives are about where is the Latinx community statewide? What do you see as some of your main concerns, and how are we faring?
Thank you very much, Teresa, for the question. When I think about how Latinx people are faring in Colorado and how we are particularly faring in the pandemic, I think about one of the earliest moments that I experienced in my family during this pandemic. I was working from home remotely, long hour day, and I got a text message from my mother, very frantic, letting me know that my little cousin, who, for the sake of her privacy, I'll call her Elle, that Elle was dropping out of college. She was in her first year of college. And I was like, no, she's not. And I called her and I was like, hey, Elle, my mom said that you were thinking about leaving school. And she said, no, I am leaving school. I need to be able to pay my rent. I need to take more hours at my job. And because I'm paying for school out of pocket, she was attending a community college in the metro area, and it's all remote. This learning style doesn't work for me. So she described to me both the economic pressures that she was facing in the pandemic as an 18-year-old who was living in an apartment in the metro area with her partner, and the fact that she had to abandon school to be able to meet that economic need. And to me, it was a shock to my core because our parents immigrated from the state of Michoacán and Jalisco in the 80s for us to come here and be able to be upwardly mobile with education as a key component to that. And being the first in my family to graduate from college and almost a year later, being in an elected role in education, a systems leader, and then hear my little cousin saying that she was dropping out to work longer hours. And by the way, she works at a home care facility for elderly people, which is one of the most high risk frontline jobs that you can have. It just showed me that youth in our community, young people, Latinos, aren't just facing the pandemic from the standpoint about worrying about their health, but the fact that they are also managing all of these external pressures that are both economic, and there's not just a literal cost to that dollars wise, but there's a cost to that in terms of long-term outcomes, because we know that a higher education, specifically a 4-year degree, yields higher economic output and more social and economic mobility for students, especially for students who are Latino or Latinx. And so how I think we're faring is that normal wasn't working for us, and COVID has made it worse. And as systems leaders, we have to think about how we're going to not only regain ground, but really fix the root cause of these structures that were already creating inequitable outcomes.
Excellent. Thank you, Angela. And we'll come back to you because we want to hear a little more about your perspectives on education and where we go from here in terms of our youth and investment in our youth and how we are supporting our youth to ensure that this hasn't been a lost year. Bobby, when Bobby is not writing or performing or encouraging poetry, is a social worker. And so I'm really eager to hear, Bobby, your perspective on where you think the Latinx community is in this time of COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's difficult to watch because the pandemic really just magnified the things that we know to be true already, right? If our communities were othered and marginalized before, the pandemic really showed us in real time what that looks like. And we know that Latinx folks in our communities, we face disproportionate health and economic impacts, like Angela said. We know that our folks are overrepresented in industries that had been hit the hardest. We know that our folks were there on the front lines, really, working in the service industry. We were far more likely to contract COVID-19. We were more likely to be hospitalized. And then when we watched the rollout of the vaccine, we were being, vaccinated at a rate that was lower than the general population. So there are all of these things that were going on, both the personal and the collective. I really like the comment you made about the social capital and what the physical distancing did to the idea of communities, right? And not only that, but we had to reckon with the idea that we were more, likely to die from COVID, to have these things impact our communities. As somebody who works in human services, it really also, made us really consider the ways in which we deliver services to community, and how these communities who have traditionally been marginalized and disproportionately harmed we're continuing to perpetuate those things. And so also, I would say, though, as Debbie mentioned, there are so many high points too. There's so many lights in our community, so many people who came to help throughout this process. And I think that needs to be uplifted, including all the artists and the cultural workers who are doing things to make sense of the pandemic, both locally and nationally. I think of an artist, out of Texas, who was creating COVID Loteria cards with different things that were, showing the iconography of what we were going through. And so this way of translating this experience through art and culture, so that we had something to latch onto, I think is also, really, really important. And as far as where we're headed, yeah, I agree. This is a perfect time. We've noticed what can happen when collectively we decide things need to change quickly. And so if we can, make these these pivots, right, in real time to do things a bit differently, I think we can also agree that some of these structures and systems that have, marginalized our communities for far too long, they can also be quickly, they can pivot, right? And we can find new ways to do things. And that's what I'm excited for moving forward, is this idea that we may be able to just think of and employ new ways that are better for everyone.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And so I certainly don't want to ignore the fact that there are lots of opportunities as a result of where we are. I also want to understand where we are as a community and where are we rebuilding from. And so I'd love to hear from each of you where you what does recovery look like for the Latinx community? What does it look like in the next year? What does it look like in the next 5 years? Where are there places that we should be paying particular attention to and focusing on? And where do you see those being taken advantage of? And where do you see us really needing to ensure that there is greater focus? And Mike, we would love very much to hear from you and hear what your thoughts are about recovery for the Latinx community.
No, thank you. And my apologies about the problems previously. I've done this a million times. And it's funny. The one time I'm actually going to be part of the panel, I'm having my own internet problems, I've got no kids to blame, like streaming Disney Plus or playing video games. I'm not sure what's going on. But I think, so recovery, I think everybody had some really important parts. I think this is going to be the challenge. On one side, we have an incredibly resilient community that has played a significant role in every previous economic recession's recovery. We just did a small roundtable with the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, with the United States Secretary of the Treasury, and she highlighted very specifically about how critical it is to be able to go through and support the Latino community, as we go through, because they had led the recovery last time. And unfortunately, we just were kind of getting back, and recovering ourselves. But, we're going to play a really strong role in terms of being able to go through and lead this recovery again. So with this population size of 62.5 million, I think an incredible resilience and work ethic, belief in the American dream, and one statistic I will point out is that, Latino and Latina-owned businesses are 60% less likely to get a loan than your Anglo counterparts. And with less capital, we have been able to open up more businesses. So that's one, I think, positive side. Now, being able to go through and really make sure that we are going through and supporting our city and our state's recovery efforts, and the country as a whole, I think it's going to be important for us to really think about how this term equity applies to what we're talking about, and being able to really look at the gaps that everybody has mentioned very specifically, and then understand the diversity within the Hispanic community, and the challenges within each one of those communities. I think we look at stratification based upon geography, based upon language, based upon country of origin, based upon degree of assimilation and culturization, and those basically, I think, is going to be the magic in terms of how better we understand and how willing we're able to go through and supply the necessary resources to the appropriate parts of the Latino and Latina communities to be able to go through and help us recover.
Great. And what will need to happen in places where policy is made, Deborah? What are the kinds of things that you see are needed? And is there work that is already being done? And what is that work that will support recovery specifically for the Latinx population?
So even though it feels like so long ago, we were actually in the middle of our census 2020 when COVID hit. And our efforts to try to make sure that our Latinx community was counted, and that equates to dollars that come back to your local and state communities. And the data from the census becomes really vital around how we have representation and how our districts are reapportioned. And that process will take place now at the state level. And then eventually, once they finish the reapportionment and the re-precincting process, that data is shared at the local level and at the school board, RTD, local government, we will then be engaged in redoing the boundaries for our communities. And that, is done every 10 years to make sure that you have equal number of people living within each district. And that becomes really important to make sure that it's a fair process and that it doesn't gerrymander our communities in a way that diffuses the representation that we enjoy today, by ensuring that voices that look like people in our communities are seated at the table and representing all of those issues that so many of our communities are struggling with, whether it's our business community, whether it's part of our community that's part of the LGBTQ folks who have different kinds of challenges, but across the board, as decision makers who prioritize how we spend funding, that piece plays such a critical role in what will happen in the next few years. And I'm just grateful that we have a city that has fair elections. And in the last election cycle, they did an outstanding job making sure that we had voting drop-off sites across our city so that everybody, including people who are unhoused, were able to participate in the electoral process. And so policy matters when it comes to how resources are distributed, and equity is very much a part of it's at the top of the decision making. And in the city of Denver, I worked with our administration to look at the city of Seattle, who already incorporates race and equity into the work of all the agencies. And Denver has made great strides in moving towards that end. We're beginning to implement race and equity in the work plans of all of the agencies to ensure that communities who have been marginalized, that have always been at the bottom of the scale of getting, some of their basic infrastructure needs met, those are now front and center in the decisions being made and how we prioritize those resources.
I'm so glad that you raised the issue of redistricting and tied that to the census. We know that congressional redistricting throughout the state is underway, and it remains to be seen what amount of census data will be available in that decision-making process. And I certainly don't envy those commissioners that very difficult job. There's also talk about Colorado receiving another congressional district, which certainly changes things for some parts of the state. And we also know that the state has redistricting of Senate districts and House districts in order to balance out those numbers every 10 years. Help us understand the timeline of then how does that translate to counties and municipalities and their redistricting of things like council districts and school districts?
So the data from the census, the U.S. Census Bureau, isn't even going to be available till September. So people at our state level who will be doing the redistricting process can't even start their work until they have the data. So it's all of that process that has to happen at the state level with the reapportionment of the congressional districts, the redistricting of the state legislative districts, and then the re-precincting process. And then the local governments can begin to engage in how we will redo the boundaries, and it's making sure that you have the software to look at the mapping. And then, part of that ensures that we're following the Voting Rights Act and not violating, the issue I raised earlier of trying to gerrymander people out of being able to have representation that, that looks like those of us who are on this panel.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it will take some time. It won't be until next year that local government will actually be in the middle of this process, because it's going to take a while for the state process to occur.
One of the things I think it is really important that folks are aware of is that all redistricting from congressional level to state level to counties and municipalities to determining those districts, those processes all come with public hearings. And those public hearings invite folks to give feedback about what those maps should look like. And so if you're in a congressional district and you believe that the interests of your community are not being upheld and should be, then being more involved in that process at whatever level you would like to speak to, there are lots of opportunities for that. So I'm really hopeful that that Latinx folks in general throughout our state will take advantage of those opportunities to be a part of those hearings, make their voices known, and help those who are making those decisions to understand the needs of our community and to understand what we want to see happen and what historically demands that must happen for so that our voices matter and that our voices can be as amplified as possible. So thank you for that. I want to turn to you, Angela, and I want to talk a little bit about education. As a Denver Public Schools board member, I would imagine that you've been doing a tremendous amount of work looking at how you boost equity at a time when equity is more critical than ever. So what's happening in DPS, because that is certainly what all of our other school districts look to DPS for the model of what are the kinds of innovative things that are happening. And so share with us a little bit, give us your snapshot of where things are for students and families in education, and where do you hope us to be in another 5 years?
Thank you, Theresa, for that question. I think first it's important to recognize that students don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in households that are multi-generational, that are facing outside economic pressure. So when we think about recovery for students, it's imperative to think about students within the context of the family units that they belong to. For example, I spoke to a teacher who teaches at Knapp Elementary, which is my neighborhood elementary school here in Westwood. And she talked about how her students were not connecting to remote learning in the thick of the pandemic, and said that even far and beyond the academic performance of her students during this remote learning environment, what she was most concerned about was the fact that she had students who had both parents in the hospital because they had contracted COVID in their workplace. And then later, when Debbie, myself, and other locally elected officials met with Denver Public Health, they let us know that the Latinx community, especially on the West Side, had not seen an increase in COVID positivity rates, but actually seen a persistently high plateau, meaning that throughout this whole year of the pandemic that we've been in, the rates have maintained super high. So while I will definitely speak to what our school district is doing and can do more of as it relates to equity, I think it's super important that we do not let up the pressure on our state and local governments on making sure that we close the vaccination gaps, especially as we're seeing many states nationwide turn to wanting to end mask mandates or start to open up early. If we do that and don't close the gaps of vaccinations among the Latino population here, we are going to basically ensure that plateau, that pandemic never ends for the Latinx community. Before this call, I went on to the Kaiser Family Foundation, because with my work at Planned Parenthood, we're also doing work around the vaccination rate. And I saw that in the state of Colorado, though we're a third of the population, and always have been because it's Colorado, we're only 9% total vaccinated, even though we make 36% of cases and 25% of deaths. And this is a sharp contrast to the 83% of white people who are vaccinated currently. And again, we know, based on what Bobby shared, based on what you spoke about, that is based on what Debbie spoke about, that when you think about DPS students and you think about the students that are being taught by that teacher who I mentioned at Knapp Elementary, their parents are essential workers. So the road to recovery in the short term means that we need to close the vaccination gap between Latinx people, especially among the Latinx population that is disproportionately represented in who are considered essential workers, including my own family members here on the west side of Denver. And then on the school side, we're really focusing on what we're calling learning acceleration, as well as leveraging the summertime as a really important time in the school year to be able to accelerate that learning. Also, from thinking about students in the high school level, making sure that we're bolstering and increasing the number of students who are enrolled in rigorous coursework so they're actually on a path to be able to enroll in college. Because here are some of the things that have occurred to Latinx students specifically. As it relates to reading, we saw Latinx students face the largest decrease on the READ Act assessment and only have 44%, a 4% decrease of students reading on grade level or above. We also saw, and this is when we talk about the diversity of the Latinx community, thinking about students who speak multiple languages. I myself, Spanish is my first language, and I was a Spanish-speaking student at school and learned English when I was in first and second grade. Our multilingual students have been, especially within the Latinx population, damaged by the effects of the pandemic. We saw that movement between proficiency levels dropped most significantly for our multilingual students from the fall to the mid-year, 20% drop. And you see those patterns repeated when you look at the college enrollment rates, which have decreased. When you look at persistence rates of college graduation rates, and also when you think about the fact that it is still true that 50%, less than 50% of students who are, even when they get to be enrolled in school, will actually graduate from college within less than 6 years, not 4 years, 6 years. So when we think about recovery for us, it's really important to think about our students within the context of the family units that they inhabit, because it affects their socio-emotional disposition to be learners. I remember when I was a second grade teacher, I knew that it was not fair to tell my student whose dad had gotten incarcerated by Immigration and Customs Authority, I forgot, ICE, La Migra, when they ended up incarcerated in the detention center or didn't get enough food to eat, that I could not expect my student to sit crisscross applesauce on my carpet ready to learn to read. We need to think about our students in the context of the families that they live in economically and also health-wise to really close those vaccination gaps and rates, and make sure that at the level of the federal government, we're passing those 2 bills that passed in the House into the Senate for immigration reform, for not only the dreamers, but also their parents, and for the farm workers. Colorado has a lot of farm workers who would greatly benefit from that. And we have a lot of Latinx families in mixed status households. So I think really making sure that we think about students in a holistic way inside the school system and outside the school system is really the way to go. And as it relates to the school system itself, making sure that our students are accelerating their learning during the summer, when they go back to school, if they're not already in school 100% in person, that they get that time, and that perhaps we look at things like an extended school year with the summertime, and making sure that we have wraparound supports before and after school for our students, which again were things that our community already needed and that now we not only need, but are demanding. You're muted, Theresa.
Thank you very much for unmuting me. So I'm very glad to hear you talk about some of the options. I'm wondering, is DPS considering an extended year in the future and looking at what can be done to invest in summertime and sort of stem what I think I've heard educators refer to sometimes as the summer slide, where kids are forgetting in that 3-month period of time a lot of what they learned in the previous years. They have to spend the next year sort of catching them back up. What are some of the things that DPS is doing to stem things like summer slide? Because those were issues before and are certainly going to continue to plague our community now.
So we are exceptionally lucky that the pandemic happened during the course of time where presidential administrations also changed, because school districts across the country received massive influx of federal dollars after the CARES Act. We'll receive another influx of federal funds now thanks to the American Rescue Plan Act. And in Denver Public Schools specifically, we saw upwards of about $55 million of additional funding for the school system. What's important to recognize there is that it's one-time funding, so we have to use it within this period of time. But we are focusing the investment of those monies into what we call our crisis priorities, of which equity is a through line for all of them. And when it comes to accelerating learning, we are concentrating some of those federal dollars to boost programming available to students and families over the summer and throughout the school year. So while we're not formally extending the calendar, because that has implications for our contracts with our various labor unions and workers, and also we have to recognize the fatigue that teachers have felt this year managing childcare in their own homes, teaching remote learning on top of all of the secondary effects of the trauma that their students face, plus how they're experiencing the pandemic. So there are some challenges about formally extending the calendar year, but we are investing our federal funding in two places that I would say other school districts should consider. One, we've already talked about the summer. The second is also in bolstering the money that we offer for mental health supports. I was speaking to a high school senior this year, also a resident of Westwood, this morning. Great news. She got into Barnard College and the University of Southern California. Some like really great bright spots. She's one of the students who isn't covered by DACA yet because the program was not existent when she was a qualifying age, and she's got her application in, and either way she got full rights to both of those schools. So I'm super proud of her. She's my student advisor, but one of the things that she told me was if I was a policymaker, I would invest more money in mental health. And she talked about the mental health impacts that this pandemic has had on students, being cloistered in their homes, not being around their friends and their peers, not being able to be around their family members, plus the pressures that they're witnessing their caregivers undergo, like with losses of jobs and things like that. And so she talked a lot about the need to make sure that especially secondary students are able to access mental health resources. And that is another thing that we are doing as a school district to leverage our additional federal funds and also our mill levy funds, which are great because they're continuous, is increase the number of mental health professionals that are available on school campuses, because many times, even if there is a mental health professional on campus, they're spread super thin, doing testing for students with disabilities to be compliant with federal law, and are just in general spread thin. And so we're increasing the number of professionals that are available to schools and doing that with an equity lens. Which schools are the schools that have the highest needs for students with mental health needs? All students have that need, but we know that our Latinx students have disproportionate stressors that maybe some of their other white colleagues don't have to face. So those two things, the use of federal funds for the summer months and also for mental health supports, is something that I would encourage any person in the state of Colorado to reach out to their school board and ask, how are we spending our federal funds that we got from both COVID relief packages, and how is it directly impacting students? And I want to shout out Jasmine Rodriguez in the Roaring Fork School District, small rural district, but she is the first Latina to be elected to that school board, and very uniquely understands the plight of a lot of our first generation and immigrant students, and is asking those questions when maybe others haven't asked them before.
Certainly that speaks to the value of having the right people in the room making those decisions. I also want to give a shout out to all of the out of school programs that have really picked up the slack and have supported parents here in our community. We have recreation programs like La Gente, but we have comprehensive programs that are offered through History Colorado and our community museum. Boys and Girls Club is also, I think, really deserving of lots more investment. I think those kinds of entities that do that run programs and do that kind of work that include not just kids but the whole family can really help folks to ensure that kids are ready to go back to school in September. So thank you very much for that. One of the things that you mentioned that I think gives me a tremendous amount of hope is that as representation looks different among elected leaders in our state, as there are more brown faces, more women in positions of power and in policymaking positions. One of the things that I think has been really incredible for me to see is the ways in which many folks are using their collective voice as elected leaders in order to bring change. And so I want to talk a little bit about the role of media. I know that there are some things happening around an editorial that was shared in the around 9 News and their changing dynamics. 9 News is certainly a staple in Denver, but it is also a staple in many other parts of the state beyond the metro area, and certainly folks who have cable. And so I think the ways in which that's playing out, the ways in which elected leaders have collectively come together to address some of their concerns around media and media representation are really important. And I'm wondering if either you, Angela, or Deborah might be able to speak to that issue.
Debbie, do you want to go since I spoke last for a really long time?
Let me unmute myself. Yeah, I've been part of a communication among so many of our Latina leaders. As you know, Channel 9 has had Latina representatives who have been either news anchors or they're some of the reporters that do the news. And there have been several of them that have been let go. And so a letter was sent to the general manager of 9 News asking for a meeting with Latina elected leaders to have a conversation about that, because it is important that people in our community see folks that look like them, you know, on our news channels, and they can communicate the message of what's going on in our communities. They can walk into our neighborhoods and be able to, in many cases, speak the language and be able to understand what the challenges are that they're trying to convey to the broader public. I mean, just the information alone about these statistics, and, you know, the fact that we have families that are multi-generational, and that in itself has exacerbated the exposure, you know, again, with so many of them having to work just to keep, you know, a roof over their head and food on the table. But you're cramping people into small quarters because that's how they're able to survive. I mean, with the cost of living that has gone up in our city, so across, you know, our state, actually, it's important that, you know, you constantly look at the right policy. So, for example, as we have had dollars that have come to the city as well, how we're prioritizing that and making sure that we're pushing money out to assist people with rental assistance and with utility assistance. We just learned that Denver Water is going to start doing shutoffs for people who haven't paid their water bills. So those utility assistance dollars become really vital so that we're not further challenging people's ability to just remain housed when everything just keeps, you know, piling on. And so the getting back to your question about Channel 9, I mean, that being able to convey some of these kinds of messages and the issues and challenges that so many of our families are dealing with is an important part of the bigger conversation and the picture that the general public gets to see and understand. And it also creates the opportunity where other people can weigh in and be part of the solution, whether it's through donor giving, participating in volunteer work or whatever that creates the opportunity to ensure that the resources are getting where they're most needed.
And I want to say that I feel like the model that that folks certainly in Denver and Latina leaders coming together to attempt to address that specific issue is really emboldening people in the rest of the state to begin to ask questions around how are we represented in our local media market? Who are the voices that are sharing our issues, and are they being covered in the ways that we want them covered? And so I feel like that that collective power that you all are really harnessing together is critical, not just for solving issues in your own community, but is a tremendous model for what things can look like and what people power can look like in the rest of the state.
Yeah.
And it's also important for us to get to know who those reporters are and to create the opportunities for them to be more engaged within our community. I see Mike has his hand up and wanted to add something as well to this, but
let's hear it, Mike.
They're part of our community, so we need to engage them in a bigger way. You're muted, Mike.
I've been having these internet issues. It's so frustrating. I've been like chomping at the bit, but I think that, to kind of add on to what Debbie had talked about, I think the 9 News situation, it's very disappointing, and it's very disappointing for all the reasons that Debbie had mentioned. But I'll tell you what else. Like, we're in a heightened sense of DEI right now. I mean, there is no time that it would mean more than right now for them to be able to go through and think about the importance of diversity in the newsroom, diversity of voice, to be able to go through. And the simple fact that they're not doing it now really kind of like raises a flag. In addition to that, it is not only the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. Okay. We're looking at like a United States Hispanic market, 62.5 million people nationwide, representing $1.7 trillion of buying power. That buying power for the United States Hispanic market is bigger than the entire Canadian economy. It's often referred to as a country within a country. And if the United States Hispanic market was its own country, the GDP would be $2.6 trillion, making it the 8th largest economy in the world. Colorado is the 8th most populated Hispanic state. The buying power in Colorado is $30 billion for the Hispanic community. Okay, $30 billion. That is as big as our state budget. The largest industry in economic impact Colorado has is oil and gas. That is $30 billion. That is the value here. We do not only have one Spanish language television station that is full power, we have 4 in Denver. Okay, that shows you the size of this market. So this is not only their current viewer, but this is also their future viewer. So that, I think, raises additional flags in maybe what I would refer to as a blind spot, or we would call implicit or explicit, in regard to, this kind of like, bias that maybe we just need to start talking about this a little bit more, and that we're not looking basically at, what is occurred, over the last year in a really binary fashion, because we do have a substantial amount of community that is going to be everybody's future consumer, a substantial amount of everybody's future workforce, and a substantial amount of everybody's future voter. So I think right now, the thing that I'm most grateful of are people like Debbie and her colleagues on city council, Angela and her colleagues. We have great Latinas at the General Assembly, and they are doing all they can with sometimes like limited resources and limited support. And Angela talked about the vaccine gap earlier, like that's bad. I mean, we're at 6%. The last data I saw, we are in Denver, we are at 6% in terms of Hispanic vaccination 2 weeks ago. All other minorities were at 15%. Anglos were at 25%. And whoever mentioned, we are not out of the single digits yet statewide. California is being sued right now because of their inequitable, basically, vaccination program. And I would compare it, Debbie talked about the census beforehand. This is the low-hanging fruit. It's going to get more difficult the longer we go through, and once again, we've had people on the front lines. We have not had a great amount of resources in terms of messaging, in terms of really kind of combating a lot of the negative anti-vaccine messaging. So there's a lot of work that I think needs to be done, but it starts with, I think, understanding the value and the growth and the size of this community. And it's not a one-size-fits-all strategy. I love that we have 162 languages spoken at Denver Public Schools. I think that's fantastic. I love the fact that we have an incredibly diverse community, but I also feel it is not equitable, if we're waiting to translate something into 25 different languages before we're getting Spanish out the door, and I think Spanish is the first one. I think Vietnamese is another one, that we need to go through. So that is the difference between this idea of equity. Like, we don't need to get choose to everybody. We need to make sure we get choose, to people and make sure they fit. So.
Great. There's a question that came in from a listener, Luri Rueda. And the question that they're asking, I think, is really a great lead into to where we've gotten this far. And the question is, building vaccine confidence among the Latinx community has been challenging. What are folks' ideas on community engagement programs?
So something that I would recommend is to leverage the faith community responsibly and culturally competent here. When this vaccine gap became evidently pressing, and when many of us got the sense that if we weren't going to do it, then nobody else was, and started organizing equity vaccine clinics. One of the ones that Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez wanted to do in Westwood was at St. Cajetan's Catholic Parish. And she called me and she asked me if I could connect her to the parish to see if they would be willing to be a host. And this was a brilliant, culturally relevant, responsive, and competent suggestion, because St. Cajetan's, San Cayetano, which is the parish that I belong to, is the second largest Latino parish in the whole state of Colorado. It has a long history of social and political activism, and the parish is 100% Latinx, with a very high concentration of elders who had not gotten the vaccine. And we understood why, because we represent that area. We understood that our elders weren't getting the vaccine because they might not have emails, as Mike suggested, because information wasn't available to them in Spanish, first off, about how to get the vaccine, much less combating disinformation. I had to beg public officials to get me information in Spanish that I could share on my social media channels. Sometimes it would take 3 days. Sometimes it would take a week. Sometimes I never got it. And so we knew that at San Cayetano, we could be able to solve the scheduling challenge, which is the number one challenge that exists with these vaccine clinics, because you can't just give somebody a link and expect that they're going to navigate their way to that and be able to sign up. We built a very targeted list at San Cayetano. And I think to the point about disinformation, the other thing that we did was make sure that we talked to Father Angel, who is the current priest at San Cayetano. And he made, leading up to the vaccination clinic itself, with about 4 weeks of anticipation, after every mass, and at San Cayetano, there's about 7 masses on a Sunday. That's how big it is. He would make an announcement at the very end in Spanish at the Spanish Mass and in English in the English Mass for the Chicanos. And he would say, I am getting the vaccine during this clinic. If you are eligible, go sign up after Mass so that you can get an appointment and join me in doing so. He followed in Pope Francis's declaration that getting the vaccine is an ethical and moral act that all Catholics should do. I know that not all Latino people are Catholic, but a lot of us are. And so to have the priest be a model, go down and get vaccinated, helped combat disinformation. To have the volunteers participating in that clinic be people who they knew. I saw so many elders who I've known since I was like 6 or 7, and they'd say, no me la quiero poner. And I'd be like, sí se la tiene que poner. Ya ve, el sacerdote se la puso, el papa se la puso. And it was nice to have that reinforcement peer-to-peer as well. And so I think that is a really great example. It's unfortunate to hear that some archdioceses have made the decision to say negative things about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I think that's really irresponsible and does not really do honor and justice to the largely Latinx feligreses, I don't know how to say that in English, parishioners that make up the majority of the Catholic Church that keep it alive in the state of Colorado, much less in the United States. So I think making sure that as when we think about best practices to close the gap, that we think about language access, internet access, and then figures who are trusted in the community, who can be models of why not only is the vaccine safe, but why you should get the vaccine. I think the tagline at Servicios de la Raza, who also has a really great campaign, was vacúnate para tu familia. Vaccinate yourself for your family. Vaccinate yourself because you love your community. And really hitting in on those two messages that are universally true across all of the populations within the Latinx community. Our family is important to us, and we love our family. And so that is why we need to get vaccinated.
It has absolutely been critically important to share with folks in positional power that the resistance to vaccine is far greater, and I think it's being very underestimated. And so I think you're absolutely spot on. We're doing a clinic here in Pueblo at Sacred Heart Church in Avondale. It is an area where there are large numbers of seasonal workers, seasonal agricultural migrant workers that are arriving in that community. And we've been there every Thursday for the last 2 months, simply talking to folks. And it takes 3 or 4, and we only do registration clinics. We don't have an outward facing clinical presence at Center for Health Progress. Our shtick is organizing. And so it is really about who are the trusted folks within the migrant community, not who are the elected leaders who, what is the latest public service announcement that's coming out on English speaking television. It is who are the people that folks see day to day, who they can trust. And so we knew we're going after the Ariola family, we're going after this family, we're going after this family. And they were the first ones in line to get vaccinated. But it took 2 or 3 weeks. And it really is, it's not medical experts, it's not elected leaders, it is folks in that community who are getting vaccinated. Other immigrant women who are Spanish speaking themselves are doing that work. Promotoras in this process cannot be underestimated. We use a Caracol model of promotoras. And really it is Pati Serna who's out there saying, I got vaccinated a month ago. And this is why. She is who's convincing people to get vaccinated. And so we're doing the Johnson & Johnson single dose at a Catholic parish on Friday, and doing all of the registration leading up to that. So folks have plenty of time to ask questions and to talk to one another has been a really critical piece of this. And so I think it's really about who are the organizations that have been on the ground all through COVID. For our organization, for Center for Health Progress, we've been doing phone trees with hundreds of people in our community for all of 2020, and that continues now in 2021, and that's what provides us the opening to be able to do some of this vaccination work. Mike, I know you've got something you want to say, and then Debbie, we'll hear from you.
Yeah, and I would say that I agree that I think that is an important piece to be able to go through and focus on in terms of this community trust. But I also don't think that's enough. And I think I would compare it is if Debbie was going to run for governor, we are not going to get her elected just knocking on doors and handing out flyers. Remember, we have 2 million Hispanics in this state, making up 22% of the population. Okay. Now, not all parts are equal in terms of challenges, but there are definite information gaps that have existed since the beginning of this. Pre-COVID, we had a low foundation of health and information in a lot of our immigrant and dominant Spanish-speaking communities. And there was an overdependence upon, black market pharmacies up and down Colfax and Federal, based upon the negative information from the president of Mexico. I mean, there are a lot of things that kind of, I think, collided. And we have not, I think that part of it is we want to make sure that we don't end up doing what we did at the beginning of this. So I think that we need more resources. I think we need to amplify message. I think we need to think about the different individual channels, and think about, I would compare it to the census campaign. I would really think part of it is, and part of it is grassroots, but part of it is making sure we have resources to send out the necessary, broadcasts and messages to be able to make sure that we're educating the community and allowing them the opportunity to make the choice, which I hope is a choice to get vaccinated, but nevertheless, like making sure the information comes across. I suggest using, international musicians, actors, all kinds of different sports stars. I mean, there's a lot of, everybody kind of like has this different point of influence that resonates with them, but it's not a singular point of contact. It is frequency, and it is multiple points, of being able to get that message across. So that is the only point that I feel like everybody's working so hard, but part of it is to scale, right? We need to scale.
Agreed.
The way we're going right now, it's going to take us 3 years. So we need to scale this, and a washing machine works hard, right? But what we need to do is make sure that we go through and utilize like traditional means of communication to amplify these messages appropriately. So I think resources.
You're absolutely right. It's a both and strategy. It's about all of these multiple pieces. And my point is really about that we should be resourcing all of these places. What we've got now in our state is a clear, well-funded, well-staffed system whereby out of all of the folks that have been vaccinated, 89% of those have been white folks. And then we have a parallel system that is vaccinating folks of color with volunteers and with little to no funding. Right. And so the fact that we have a very stratified vaccine delivery system in the state of Colorado, and nonprofits who are already stretched to the max are being asked to do more and more and more and more and more. And I went to a funeral last Friday for a 47-year-old woman who died of COVID complications here in our community. So we know that these nonprofits are stepping up to the table because lives are at risk. And we know that folks are doing more with less. But looking at that systemically means we have to be really truth tellers in saying we have a well-funded, well-staffed system that's doing great in vaccinating white folks, but we are not vaccinating people of color in the same ways, and we are not resourcing those systems in the same ways. That's really critical. Angela, and then Debbie.
Oh, I was just affirming everything that you were saying. I don't have anything to add because I think that the and approach that you mentioned, and also the very clear stratification, the number of there have been weeks during this pandemic where I have not had a day off because I work 7 days a week. Fortunately, at my house remotely, but still very long days, do school board at night. And then on the weekends, I'm volunteering at our vaccine clinics. And I think it's really important to point out that when we do these vaccine clinics, it's not one, it's two, because there's two dosages. And then when we're not volunteering ourselves, we're finding volunteers. We're texting Debbie's staffers, who some of mine who are friends from college. And I'm like, hey, Joe, can you sign up your friends to come help us? We need help. And so I think that you're speaking truth to power in a way that I really appreciate. And I'm sensing a frustration deep inside myself that I have not had a chance to express about those long hours. It is very satisfying work. At our last vaccine equity clinic at Regis, I was able to vaccinate two of my uncles, not I personally, but we were able to vaccinate two of my uncles who are essential workers, their wives who are essential workers, my neighbors, like what you were saying about the social networks, they're roofers. I was like, here's the information. Tell your crew to call me, and we got them all signed up, and that was really like empowering to see. But I shouldn't have to do that volunteer wise. You shouldn't have to do that volunteer wise. Debbie shouldn't have to do that volunteer wise. There is a social contract that underpins government between the citizens, and I mean citizens as in residents of a democracy, not legal status, and the government. And that social contract is formalized when you pay your taxes, when you contribute to our local system in any sort of way. And so it makes me think about how broken our social contract is along racial and ethnic lines, at the point at which we have to rely on volunteers to staff clinics to vaccinate a third of our state, of which we, as we've talked about, we're not even close to vaccinating yet. So thank you for allowing me that moment of catharsis.
So here's the bottom line. State government and local government are getting dollars to do this work, right? I mean, it's not like like we're having to go fundraise for these resources to administer the vaccine for people. And it just boggles my mind. And we've been very vocal with our environmental health people from our city, our public health folks from our city, to talk about the equity issues. We've had Dr. Berman from Denver Health, who has been part of our conversations, to ensure that they are hearing from us as elected leaders why we have to be doing more and not expecting this to be done with volunteers, but to be utilizing the resources that we're getting to do the work for the people who have been hit the hardest with this pandemic. They're the frontline workers. They're being exposed at the greatest level. They're, trying to put food on the table and take care of their families. Many of them, if they don't go to work, if they've tested positive, they don't have the resources to make sure they've got food on their table. It's why programs like DPS had, and the fact that Denver has the Healthy Food for Denver Kids funding, was successful in being able to push out food sources through our schools, at our schools, to make sure that the very families who needed it the most were getting it. But this inequity of how this vaccine is being administered is frustrating. And those of us who are on city council have been very noisy about that. And the city is now rolling out permanent sites. And the reality is, our city did not have a plan. We did not have a vaccination plan. And it wasn't until they started seeing us start this process in Northwest Denver, and then it started happening in other parts of the city where these equity clinics were taking place. And it's because we were working with representatives from the state to get this done. It wasn't happening at the local level. And then I think they realized this needed to be happening in a much bigger way across the city, so that we're getting to our Latino community across Denver. I was on the phone last week with my aunt, my dad's sister, that live in Lakewood. They haven't been able to figure out where to get their vaccine. They're in their 80s. They should have been in that first tier. And the fact that I keep hearing elder folks who have not gotten their vaccines, but yet this Friday, we're going to just open it up to everybody. It is infuriating that we have not made sure that our community is front and center, because we're the hardest hit. And we have to continue to work together in being obnoxious, in making sure that we're pushing that envelope to make this happen. Because Angela is absolutely right that if everything starts opening up and people don't have to wear their masks, our folks who are those frontline workers will continue to be exposed at the greatest level, especially if they've not been vaccinated. So this is vital to us being able to have the sustainability as part of the population in this state, and to continue to be contributing members. And when we start talking about equity, it's also about how we make sure that the resources that are coming to our state for the businesses also get, support those businesses. And the complexities of it are challenging, and we should be having technical assistance to assist our small businesses in writing a small application to access those resources. Because when you see where the money actually went, it was to bigger businesses who actually got the dollars more so than our small struggling businesses. So it's these kinds of things that, some of us at the table, at the policy level, have been obnoxious about. I mean, initially, we weren't even giving money to our nonprofits. And I said, wait a minute, they're the ones at the front lines also trying to meet the need and the demand of our families. You know, many of them run the food banks. Many of them are trying to provide job information. They have computer, labs for people to access information. Many of them relied on elderly people to be their volunteers, who lost many of their volunteers, and they were trying to do a lot of that work with skeleton staff. So it's the kinds of advocacy and collaboration that we have to continue to do, to be loud and obnoxious, to make sure that we are getting those resources to our community where they are most needed.
And you're speaking about the role that we all have in asking those important questions
Absolutely.
of our elected leaders. And it's also an important role for white allies of folks of color to be asking those questions and to be saying, what are we doing? Because this isn't about benevolence for people of color.
Right.
This is about a recognition that we're all in this together. And when we provide for those who have been most marginalized, it gets better for all of us. And so go ahead.
Theresa, I want to take advantage of this opportunity and make sure that we share information about some resources that we've provided. I'm not sure how you wanted to do that, but we have resources for Denver, and then we have statewide resources for people who are still trying to get the vaccine, people who are trying to access the rental and utility assistance, people who have filed their unemployment who need the employment assistance. So those are Denver resources. And
I would ask folks to take screenshots of these slides, but they'll also be available on the Colorado Humanities website after the fact, where folks can go back and take a look at these.
Great. So that's Denver. If we could show the Colorado one, that would be awesome.
Yes. Fantastic. There was also a point that was made in the comments by Laura Garcia about not ensuring that folks aren't feeling pressured to be vaccinated. And that's been, I think, a very key part of the work that we've done in our own community, is that we're not here to pass judgment. There are very valid reasons that people have for being mistrustful of medical systems and of government systems that have failed us at every turn or failed us in many other instances before. And so we really attempt in our work with folks to acknowledge those fears and to also provide the best information and to share with folks the best and latest information we have so that they can make good choices for themselves and their families.
So I just want to add that I went and got my vaccine at Clinica Tepeyac. And when I talked with the executive director, Jim Garcia, I said, would you mind if we get some media coverage? And I also had our RTD board chairman join me. And they were very happy. Actually, they're the ones that reached out to the media and got the media, Spanish-speaking media there to cover it. And it was important for me to do that because my own daughter works in law enforcement. And she's in an environment where they're exposed day in and day out, just like all the rest of our frontline workers. And she's been very reluctant to have the vaccine. And I had to show her and the rest of the public, it was important to be a role model for others to see that, I could get it and it was painless. And I had absolutely no effects. I had the Moderna vaccine. And then I went 30 days later and had my second one and had no effects from that one either. And so being able to share with folks the experiences that we've had is an important part of the communication and alleviating the fears. I mean, I've had some people say they want to wait. And when they hear others who have had it done and that we've had no effects from it, it encourages more and more people to have the vaccine. And you're right. I mean, we shouldn't be trying to shove it down anybody's throat, but at the same time, if we allow everybody off the hook from taking it, it means if they get it, they're exposing their own families and their whole circle of people to it. And so it's part of our collective responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think Mike made a really good point that if we continue to vaccinate at the rate that we have, it'll take us 3 years to get enough folks vaccinated.
And that's not acceptable.
And there is such, folks are chomping at the bit to get back to mass gatherings and to have things open up more. But we all have a responsibility in ensuring that we protect ourselves and that we do what's right for the common good. In order to create the conditions where that's a safer thing to do. I also want to, one of the things that Debbie, I think you mentioned at the very beginning, but even in an earlier conversation with Angela, she was quick to point out is that, I really laid out in my introduction the very much doom and gloom of, at the end of the 60s, the Latinx community in Colorado was doing significantly better than they were 5 decades later, and significantly better even 5 decades later than they are now, having experienced this pandemic. And so there is a lot of disparity. There are tremendous gaps. And there are contributions that the Latinx community can make, not just to our own recovery, but to the recovery of our state as a whole. So I'd like to hear from each of you. What are the unique strengths and assets of the Latinx community that we really need to call upon and rely upon in this recovery for all of us? And I would say, to start us off, it is that sense that we understand social connection and we know how to multiply social capital in ways that are very significant. Our ways of being highly relational with one another have a lot to teach us in general. But what are the other kinds of strengths and assets in our community that we should be focusing on?
I think the fact that our community is multilingual is absolutely a strength that we should leverage. I think it's a gift, having been working with Representative Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez, Senator Julie Gonzalez, City Councilwoman Amanda Sandoval, and City Councilwoman Jamie Torres, and City Councilwoman Debbie Ortega. That long list, the fact that that's a long list, and that among us working as a team, that we're able to speak to our community in the language that they can identify with, if they're Spanish dominant speakers, and having their representatives who look like them, sound like them, and also speak to them in their native language. Senator Gonzalez and I had the opportunity to do a vaccine conversation with the Consul General of Mexico. And that was all entirely in Spanish. And then they brought us back with Representative Yadira Caraveo, who is a doctor, speaking about the importance of the vaccine work. So I think highlighting the fact that our community is not only numerous, that is exercising our political power at all levels of government, but that we're supporting one another as a network. And speaking to our community in multiple languages is a tremendous asset. I think it reaffirms the fact that when Colorado was established as a state in 1876, the Constitution of the state of Colorado was written in English, Spanish, and German. And many times people act like multiculturalism or multilingualism is a modern phenomenon, but it's not. Since our founding, it's been that way. And so to have these tremendous women and elected leaders leveraging our network and speaking to our community in all of the ways, and I mean that in Spanglish as well, is an asset that we should continue to leverage, and that all counties should have Spanish, Vietnamese, and other languages be the norm that we're consistently publishing and not waiting extended periods of time for that.
Excellent. I think the state has long relied on the spirit of entrepreneurship that exists within the Latinx community, and particularly within the immigrant community. Mike, do you want to speak to that as a strength and asset that we really should be leaning into as a state?
No, absolutely. And I had mentioned it a little bit beforehand, based upon the number of businesses that we actually currently have and the growth rate that we've seen. We've seen in certain markets like Latino businesses grow at 5 times the national average. I mean, we talk every election cycle about how small business is the backbone of our economy, and really what we're talking about now is Hispanic-owned business being the backbone of our economy. So, on one side, I mean, it's incredible, right? I mean, we see this opportunity and path to entrepreneurship in terms of seeking the American dream, and when you look at a lot of the different types of data that's collected about like how people see you access the American dream, business ownership is always number one. Unfortunately, education is a very distant number two, but that provides us as a business organization that speaks the language of entrepreneurship to be able to go through and help close that gap, because we know creating economic opportunity is going to be focusing on education, while entrepreneurship is a great opportunity in terms of being able to go through from a peripheral level. So this is going to be something that is going to be critical. And we've already seen in the previous recession how Hispanic business, despite the limitations, was able to go through and really help drive our communities out of the recession. We see basically how immigration and, the Latino and Latina communities has helped staved off population decline in urban centers from the last recession. We employ a tremendous amount of people nationwide. We go through and work, despite the different challenges. We have mixed status families that have been unable to go through and receive stimulus checks until this last round was passed. So we're doing a lot with a little. I mean, the same type, I think, of spirit that you saw, Angela and Debbie, and their colleagues. Like, we have a tremendous amount of record-setting number of Latinas with city council, and the combination of them and the other Latinas at the state legislature and all across the state, like, the work they have been doing is incredible. And you see the amount of work they're doing with so little. That is the same spirit you see every single day, I think, within this entrepreneurship community. Now, what can we do with resources? A lot. And I think that is where our voice collectively now, as we see there's a greater amount of empathy. Like, there have been a lot of cleaves in the Latino community over the years. We've been operating on this scarcity to resource model, where, depending upon different let's say layers of, multi-generation, sixth generation, fifth generation, immigrant, new arrival, I speak Spanish, you don't speak Spanish, you're from Mexico, I'm from El Salvador, that we're seeing those cleaves kind of like be reduced. And we're seeing a greater amount of empathy, we're seeing a greater amount of collective voice, we're seeing a greater amount of awareness, of others around us being able to understand the diversity of our community, the size of our community, the value that it has ultimately from an economic perspective, from a social perspective. So I think there's a tremendous amount. Like, I'm very, very optimistic, because of what we're able to do now with a very limited amount of resources. Now, the opportunity is, as many people have mentioned, is, we've got to keep our foot on the pedal. And I think you're sensing, frustration from me and from Angela and from Debbie. Not as much from Debbie, she's more optimistic, but I know deep down inside, because I've worked with her on a lot of other things, but there is. And so allowing us this cathartic opportunity, is you're seeing, some raw passion. Because I think all of us have seen, and I forget exactly what the lower Greek god is, that actually is banished down to Hades, that has to roll the boulder up the hill, eternally. But that's how we all feel. My mom was a letter writer, when she was upset with us, and she was a great communicator, but she would write letters, letting us know exactly what was wrong. And I joke around that I have written so many letters, over this past 12 months with 6 pages of data, to help uncover some of the gaps and make sure that we're shining a light on the inequities and making sure we're getting a fair amount, a proportional amount, and then an equitable amount of resources delivered. And I would say, number one, like, we're frustrated because we're not even getting a proportional amount of resources, not to mention an equitable amount. So our first challenge is making sure we're getting proportional. And I think that the gaps are everywhere. Vaccine is one we focused on, taking advantage of PPP, being able to go through and get access to grants. We had vaccine rollout basically for restaurants starting on March 19th. I don't need to look at the data. I can bet $10,000 that the percentage basically of Hispanic, employees at restaurants did not get vaccines at the same rate basically Anglos did. We've had a tremendous amount of access and resources for restaurants. I guarantee you, once again, the amount of patio expansions that Hispanic-owned restaurant owners have been able to receive, much smaller, in every area, right? Winterization, resources and grants from the state level. I mean, so there are gaps. And I think part of it's information and part of it's not actually understanding. We need kind of dedicated resources to be able to go through, and we need time, right? The first come, first serve model doesn't work because we're starting basically with communication issues, translation, lack of awareness. A lot of these businesses 50% of Hispanic-owned businesses don't have banking relationships, right? So even when we talk about different models about, hey, if we're going to prioritize different types of Spanish language businesses, and we're going to go through and say, listen, we're going to look at debt consolidation, which I think is great for minority-owned businesses, not so great for immigrant or dominant Spanish-speaking businesses, because they don't have the traditional debt, right? They're using money from their families. They're not going to a bank. They're not going even basically to some of these predatory small business loans. Some are, but the majority are not. So we just need to understand that there are different challenges, and different opportunities with each one of these segments that we need to rely upon some experts within, our community to help kind of go through and understand this is, once again, not a one size that fits all. So, but the bright thing is we're all understanding, I think, the segmentation, and the diversity within our communities much better than we ever have. And we're all getting to know each other a lot better. As we basically go through, I will tell you, like 5 years ago, 2 years ago, I remember sitting at the table basically at different cocktail parties, and actually having other Latinos, talk about how like impossible it was to be white Hispanic. Now we understand you can be white Hispanic, Black Hispanic, Indigenous Hispanic, Asian Hispanic. And a lot of us are basically going through and saying, yeah, I'm multiple of those, right? And not only that though, but I'm proud of being able to go through and share this type of diversity and this type of multicultural diversity, and so we have a lot more in common with the Asian community and the Black community and the Native American community than a lot of us ever knew. So this is not an either or. This is how do we collectively build a bigger tent and make sure that we utilize the term equity in a way that it's meant to, and this is not a scarcity of resource model. It is making sure we have the resources that are, that are critical to be able to go through and make sure all of our multicultural communities, are able to go through and get ahead. So that's where I think the opportunities are.
Amen, amen. Wow, that was fantastic. I think so. Sisyphus was the Greek god that always had to push the boulder up the hill in Hades, and I think it's an apt metaphor. And we often feel like that as we're sort of stretched to the max, and we're doing the same thing again and again and again, sometimes hoping for a different result. But I also really appreciate that you keep bringing us back to this idea that that the Latinx community, Hispanics, however we name ourselves as a whole, is not a monolith, that it's a big, huge tent. I think you're absolutely right that there's tremendous asset in the fact that we've come to a greater understanding of what that broader diversity looks like within our community. And I think it's also a strength and an asset that we are actively working through the fractures that exist. For the last decade here in Pueblo, we've been working pretty consistently on the fractures that exist between the Chicanx and the Mexican immigrant community. There are very real fractures between folks whom the border crossed and folks who crossed the border. And so to be able to, and we don't often name those in mixed company. We don't often talk about those in really clearly and name those with one another or for one another. But I really feel like COVID has been sort of the period at the end of a whole decade of work that we've done in this community to try to bring folks together. I have certainly seen the fruition of that work statewide. I think in the ways that Latinx leaders have held John Hickenlooper accountable for some of his votes has been very significant and not something that you would see from such a broad coalition of folks a decade ago that we're seeing today. And I think there's a sense of urgency that is built in with COVID that is moving folks to that kind of advocacy with and for one another.
But it works though, because I think that Senator Gonzalez, was a really strong advocate in terms of putting together a group and advocating for that. And I just had a roundtable today with a lot of other Hispanic leaders throughout the country, with Senator Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico, Senator Hickenlooper. Yesterday we had some discussions with the United States Secretary of the Treasury, and President Biden actually spoke for a little while as well. But I will tell you, it works. Senator Hickenlooper came out. The first thing he mentioned was immigration. The second thing he mentioned was immigration. The third thing he mentioned was immigration. Okay, so I think part of this works. It works because, like I said, of strong leadership, and in terms of being able to go through, and having those conversations. And like I said, and so, I mean, we could not get him to stop talking about immigration, and it really was exciting to be able to go through and talk about basically like the plans and the economic impact and what he's trying to do. So it was, like I said, I think that once again is another bright light in terms of being able to go through. But you're right, holding each other accountable, making sure we keep the door open. But, I think it's also too, like having sometimes like honesty is the painful, but it's the mark of a friend, so.
Yeah, and really tapping into collective voice and collective power to make those changes happen. Absolutely, 100%. So what are the other, someone asked very early on in the comments about organizations to support. Who is it that's doing really good work around Latinx issues, and who is it that's doing really good work around equity, not only for the Latinx community, but more broadly in the state? So we want to give each of you the opportunity to mention a couple of places that you think are worth supporting, worth looking into, and worth partnering with.
So I'll go ahead and go first. So first of all, answering your question about who are some of the people that we want to work with, there's a woman in the city of Seattle. Her name is Patty Lally. She's Latina, and she is the point person who actually took their race and equity program to that next level, that started incorporating it into the work of the city agencies. And she's the person that we had people from our Human Rights and Community Partnerships office go and meet with. She's now working with our district attorney. She's working with some of our other agencies, trying to help them look at how to incorporate this work. Our Land Use and Planning Office is another office that I've put her in touch with, because when you start looking at the role that rezonings play in our community and the effect it's had on displacement and gentrification of many of our, Latinx communities, it's vital that we're able to utilize tools. And I don't want to go down this rabbit hole of explaining what the Telluride ruling is, but we have a state ruling that prohibits local government from being able to mandate affordability in rental developments. But when people are coming in asking for higher densities and they're wanting to use any of our public financing tools, we can absolutely be looking at how we extract community benefit agreements that look at affordable housing, which is a huge critical need across our state, that we can look at job, what's the word I'm looking for? Local hire goals being set so that local community people are being hired and we're not having labor brokers come in from out of state and bring their workers. But it's looking at some of those kinds of policy issues where we can make sure that the policy decisions around how we utilize our decision making is critical to people being able to have affordable housing, people being able to have access to livable wage jobs, people being able to have access to technical assistance and the resources for small businesses. I really believe that when you look at the fact that even prior to COVID, our city gets funding to be able to support small businesses. And we have supported startup businesses. All you got to do is drive up and down the Brighton Boulevard corridor. Those are all brand new startup businesses but have we supported Latino businesses at the same rate? As a local elected leader, I represent the entire community. I'm a citywide member. But at the same time, if I don't speak out on behalf of these inequities, then some of these things don't get put on the table. And so I think part of it is being able to use our voice and try to help educate and bring along our colleagues, and in this case, the administration, because Denver's a strong mayor form of government where the mayor controls the purse strings. And so it's oftentimes working with our business partners. I think the Hispanic Chamber has done an outstanding job in being a vocal advocate on behalf of the Latino community, and especially on behalf of Latino businesses that ensure that they are getting a piece of this pie. And I think we have to create a broader collaboration where we're working more in unison on some of these things and not letting just the business issues be handled by the business community, or the nonprofit issues just being handled by the nonprofit community. I think this is where, as a Latino community, which is very big and very strong in our state and in our city, I mean, I'll use the example of one that Mike and I worked on, where we had a contract that came through our airport that had no, I mean, like this much Latino participation out of a, what was it, $300 million contract, multi-year.
183 million, yeah.
And I just said, well, wait a minute. I'm not going to let you move this forward until we go back and have this conversation, because we're the largest minority population in the state, and to not include Hispanic businesses, and we had a number of, in this case, janitorial businesses. So we have to go back and fix this problem. And it took working with the business community and calling the company to the table that was selected and the people from the airport to sit down and make sure that they understood the implications. And to the credit of the chamber, I mean, they were expressing concerns that if this wasn't rectified, you know, as a community, we're willing to take it to the nth degree. And I think that threat was very impactful. I mean, when you look at the role that Title VI plays in the use of public dollars and the disparities and the disparate impact that it has on Latino communities, it's where you can use that leverage to make that noise and to try to impact a different outcome. And in that particular case, we were successful in being able to do that. So again, I think it's, the groups are there. It's looking at how we utilize them in a more effective way, and that we become far more collaborative than what we already do to be even more impactful and to ensure that the inequities and the injustices are front and center in the work that we do with those things.
So what other work needs to be lifted up? Work of organizations or individuals?
I think one of the ones that comes to mind is the Denver Public Schools Foundation. During the pandemic, we did what a lot of school districts did, which was provide bagged lunches for pickup. I remember doing that when it was like freezing parking lot. We were out there with all of our cafeteria workers as families drove by and picked up their food. And thanks to the Denver Public Schools Foundation, we were actually able to ensure that the whole family was fed. And so when students came by, the caregivers with them also were able to receive food, recognizing again what I mentioned earlier, that our students don't just exist in a vacuum, and you cannot just feed the student, you have to feed the family unit as well. And so I'm so thankful to Veronica Figoli, another member of our Latina Latinx community, who really put forth those fundraising efforts to be able to make sure that that happened. Another organization that I would donate to, and also all of the organizations I mentioned, I donate to as well, because I believe in the work that they do. Revision is a food justice organization in the Westwood neighborhood that through the pandemic has also been giving out food to families in the Westwood neighborhood, providing healthy options through all of their gardening and farm programs, also incubating local entrepreneurs in their food businesses as well, and really making sure that the Revision campus is a hub for the community. You were speaking earlier about the fractures between the Chicanx, Chicano, Mexicano community. Revision is an organization that, because of how they do their work, does that so effectively. You can see master Chicanx artists paint amazing murals from D3 Arts, which is just down the street on Morrison Road, enjoying a coffee next to the promotoras, next to my parents, next to some young hipsters who are gentrifying the neighborhood. It's really a amazing organization, Revision. And also, I would remiss if I did not mention Colorado Immigrants' Rights Coalition. During the pandemic, they operate statewide, which is one of the reasons why I'm mentioning them, getting out of my Denver bubble. And during the pandemic, we saw ICE enforcement actions, and they run something called entirely volunteer run called the Colorado Rapid Response Network. And if they don't run it, they're a really critical part of maintaining that. And I know that there was some enforcement actions happening around food distribution sites near our schools, which is grotesque. And Colorado Immigrants' Rights Coalition does a lot of great deep work and leverages the network of members that they have across the whole state. And also Earth Justice is an organization that I donate to. With the effects of global warming and climate change being as disastrous as they were this year, not to mention the eco-racism that exists, we need organizations like Earth Justice to be litigating the disproportionate impacts of eco-racism, which is not something that I personally know how to do because I'm not a lawyer and climate change is not my area of expertise, but I appreciate the work that Earth Justice has done for people in global Elyria Swansea who are disproportionately impacted by the Suncor refinery and that nasty cloud that we all have to suffer through as we drive near it, not to mention the people who actually live in that area, including students and families. So Denver Public Schools Foundation, Revision, both led by Latinas, Latinx leaders, Colorado Immigrants' Rights Coalition, and Earth Justice are the ones that come to mind.
Can I also add the Eviction Defense Fund? That is another one that has played a really important role for people who are facing eviction, and it assists them through the legal process.
I'm really glad you mentioned the Rapid Response Network that is also supported by the American Friends Service Committee. I'm a volunteer for them here in the southern part of the state, and they have a broad network statewide. And I also want to also echo the support for the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. They're doing a tremendous amount of work. And I was a donor and member of Center for Health Progress before I came to work for them. And I appreciate especially the work that they're doing on an immigrant rights health coalition. Health is 20% of our overall economy in this country. And so looking at ways to ensure that the healthcare system is more responsive to our community needs is really critical. And I think Center for Health Progress is really doing that work. I also want to lift the work that the Colorado Hispanic Chamber is doing to help small struggling businesses. They did some of that work prior to the pandemic. They've been really critical in that work during the pandemic, and I think will be really important to continuing to support and foster that spirit of entrepreneurship moving forward. Mike, are there any entities that you want to elevate and lift?
Absolutely, and I want to highlight actually one of your board members, Theresa, Dr. Lilia Cervantes.
Yes.
And so she's a physician at Denver Health, and she has been working tirelessly. Her and her team, I really can't say enough. I think that if you have an opportunity to be able to go through, send her an email, send her a note, but also part of it's being able to provide, I think, people support and resources that really need them to help them build capacity. So And I agree. Like, I think that Veronica's doing a fantastic job at DPS Foundation. And I think we're very fortunate that we have somebody who's bicultural and bilingual that really understands, can kind of channel the dollars, in the necessary ways to support that. I think Revision is doing a fantastic job. I couldn't be happier for Joanna, to be able to go through and be there. So I think that but I really want to go through and kind of highlight as well the importance of being able to make sure that we are communicating with the different foundations throughout the state. We have a very generous community here in Colorado, and we also have some very wealthy individuals that support our foundations, and they actually are, pretty well capitalized. Now, I think there's an opportunity for them to go a little deeper in terms of their investment in terms of the Latino and Latina communities. And I think that's important. I think there are some opportunities for their board members to be able to really think about, what the size, what the challenges are, and what the opportunities are in terms of being able to go through, and the role that foundation dollars can play in terms of closing the gap. And I think that what we've seen sometimes is somebody just goes through and they're going to invest in one. We don't need investment in one, we need investment in 10. We need to build capacity at all these organizations that have been on the ground and doing equity work, just not the last year, but for the last 10 years or the last 20 years. Because all of a sudden now, it's really in vogue to do equity work, right? I mean, and sometimes we consider that mission creep, where we see different organizations, go through and start chasing the dollars. So I think part of it is really making sure that we support the organizations that have been there, for the last 10 to 20 years. Not to say there aren't new organizations or opportunities basically for expansion, but I almost think of this as basically these large organizations have an opportunity, like, looking at this franchise model. If the four of us were in the beer business, and wanted to go through and expand our distribution down to El Salvador, we could do a couple different things. We could go through and we could set up shop, set up a brewery, set up a distribution network, and then over the course of maybe 5-10 years, we get some penetration. Or we go through and we invest in something that's already there, okay? And we use their relationships, their distribution, their facilities to be able to go through and speed. And so when I think about this, it's not just making a partnership, okay, and putting a logo, and having a phone call. It's about thinking about what type of capital investment can you make in Southwest Denver, in Commerce City, in Pueblo, right, in the San Luis Valley, with organizations that are already there that understand how the game works, and think about how do we help them grow, right? How do we supply them the necessary resources, expertise, to be able to go through and help them elevate and spread their message. All of us think we're social media advertising experts just because we can go through and boost something on Facebook. It doesn't work that way, right? I mean, but if we can supply the necessary expertise to be able to go through and help these organizations understand, how to run effective, campaigns, that is a value. So that's where something that I really think is important to be able to go through and do. And then I would say too, support these Latinas that have been working so hard. Really, I'm so impressed with what they're doing with such limited resources. When they have the opportunity and the need to be able to go through, and run for your election, make sure you take their phone call. Make sure you proactively reach out and support the work that they've been doing this entire time. Those are other individuals that I think we need to lift up, and not just recognize by being able to mention their names, but also recognize by being able to go through and supply and write some checks, make sure that we're going through and supporting, and making it a little bit easier, for them during a very challenging time, and we know that it's tough. One, running as a just overall Hispanic, Chicana, for any type of elected office, but as a woman too, it's even more challenging, and this has been a really challenging time as well. Right? Where a lot of us had to put a lot of things on the back burners, and there have been a lot of, let's say, conflict that we find ourselves in various communities of our own. So I think we just need to make sure that we're lifting each other up as well. So
there is tremendous leadership within our community. I'm grateful for you all as leaders for being with us this evening. Grateful to Bobby LeFebre, who had to drop off earlier from our call. But I also want to hand things back over to Paulette with the acknowledgement that there is also tremendous leadership, tremendous skill and ability that we lost in this COVID pandemic from the Latinx community. We continue to remember those folks. We continue to be led by those folks and to draw upon the legacy that they left as we rebuild and we continue to move forward. So thank you very much for being with us this evening. Paulette, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your knowledge and insights to help us better understand the legacy of race in America. Thank you for the very important work all of you are doing in the community. You've rolled up your sleeves and you're making a difference. Thank you to our state poet laureate, Bobby LeFebre, for your insights tonight and for sharing your poetry. Thank you also to our audience and audience members who posed questions and shared comments. If you would like to continue this conversation, please log on to our Legacy of Race Facebook group to share your thoughts. You can also sign up for news at the Colorado Humanities website, coloradohumanities.org, where we will keep you updated on future programming, and rest assured we are listening if you have any ideas about future topics. Please also tap into our resource page for Changing the Legacy of Race and Ethnicity, where you can find the resource slides shared tonight and where you can explore reading and viewing resources on this and other topics. Thank you again to our sponsors and partners. Have a good evening.